I've been asked to stay seated. I've just got a few notes in front of me, but what I thought I would do is just offer some observations and questions, and hopefully then inform the conversation that we all have in the balance of the session. So, Prime Minister and Cabinet, the department regulates, if you like, the regulators, and keeps up the sort of administration of regulators, and it's issued some principles of best practice regulator or regulation. And so if you think about TEQSA for a moment in your heads and run these past you, the three principles of best practice regulation: continuous improvement and building trust, risk-based and data-driven, and collaborative and engaged. So if you're sitting in the back seat of the car as a small child, you might say, are we there yet? I'd say somewhat. We're almost there. We're part of the way there. And I just offer some thoughts as to why. And it's not by way of criticism, it's by way of observation. The legislative framework within which we operate, in my view, doesn't really service best practice regulatory principles. It's now 12 years old. It reflected the settings and the politics of the time. It drives, the TEQSA Act in particular drives a cyclical assessment model for regulating higher education. It does that through provider registration, course accreditation. At least every 7 years we're required to do that as the regulator. And it encourages, if you like, a regime of imposing conditions upon providers in response to risks or concerns. So it goes to what Professor Coldrake described this morning as something of a command and control approach to regulation. The Act does reference principles of being necessary, proportionate and risk-based, and certainly there's every effort made within the agency to reflect those principles in our practice. But in reality, my view is that TEQSA remains risk-informed rather than risk-based in its regulatory model and practice. Now, a regulator meeting its objectives and the expectations of the sector must be responsive, data-driven, and as Professor Coldrake also talked about being prescient. We're very used to that at TEQSA, him saying, using that term. But anticipatory is another way of looking at it, and especially around identifying and responding to risks and trends across the sector. And we do that to some extent. Our integrity work on contract cheating is a really standout example of that. But it's not yet embedded across our practice, our operations, our legal, our policy and research, our engagement and other functions. And a dynamic and uncertain environment for the sector at present makes that capacity all the more important, in my view, in part to collaborate with and alert the sector, but as referenced this morning, to be anticipatory and to be able to advise government on emerging trends and risks across the sector. Just a couple of brief remarks on the impacts of COVID over the last 2 years. In our view, I think what COVID especially did, amongst the myriad of impacts, was to accelerate and exacerbate already apparent trends and risks across the sector. And we've developed a sort of phraseology within TEQSA of offshore, online, third party as being a really sort of strong theme of the dynamic across at least parts of the sector. Professor Coldrake referenced this morning the business models for international education and in essence the collapse of that business model through COVID, and now the repiecing together of perhaps a slightly different approach for many providers. The advent of micro-credentials, work in learning, stacked qualifications, etc. And then of course, as has been highlighted in recent media coverage, the visa system and the links between onshore education, skills needs, and frankly, permanent residence. So that's just some of the trends and risks that, in our view, or one observation might be, have been accelerated or exacerbated by COVID. Not necessarily in a bad way, just that's what's happened. The challenge for TEQSA, I think, and this is what Peter and I are trying to do through the Commission and the organisation, is to transition TEQSA to being genuinely data-driven and risk-based. and anticipatory of sector risks and trends rather than reactive and demand-driven. When I say demand-driven, around applications for registration, re-registration, applications for course accreditation, etc. And especially in looking at tweaking the balance of resources that we apply internally at TEQSA to those various components of our function and our activity. So we need to rethink, reshape the nature of our engagement and collaboration with the sector, especially as the post-COVID environment develops, if you like, or grows. I think there's a pretty strong view within TEQSA that it's time to address aspects of our regulatory model and practice, and we're working on that internally at the moment, and we expect over the next 1 to 2 years to be engaging the sector on that review and adaptation, if you like, of our regulatory model and practice, reflecting some of the principles that I've talked about. And now, of course, with the Higher Education Accord and the review of the terms of reference being very broad and extending to the regulation of the sector, there's a further opportunity, as we see it, to achieve some buy-in across our stakeholders, in particular, of course, the government, to that review and remodelling of our regulatory approach and practice. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there, Adrienne, and hopefully that sparks some conversation.
Peter.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. I will take straight from where you left off, where you were talking about the accord, as you called it, the Higher Education Accord, which is a preferable title than Universities Accord when it comes to my general membership in independent higher education. As Adrienne's introduced me before, I have a degree of expertise in public policy over many, many years, but nowadays it's part of my job to be a higher education tragic, and so and I'll just give you a sense of that. So on Monday last week I flew over to Perth to visit some of the members of ASQA, and that's a 5-hour flight. So what did I do? I read the Denise Bradley report from 2008, and why I did that was because that was a very, very comprehensive review of higher education. It was a panel that was put together by Julia Gillard at the time when she was Education Minister, Denise Bradley, Bill Scales was on it, Peter Noonan and Helen Nugent. Very esteemed collection of people who did a review. They spent the best part of a year doing it, and a large part of what they proposed ended up with us having TEQSA, for example, and so ASQA as well. But why I mention all that is because the Minister, in conversation with us at ASQA, but probably with a lot of you in the room, has also said that he sees this big review that we're just embarking on as Bradley 2.0. So it's relevant to go back to Bradley and see what was being proposed for the regulatory landscape and also the other issues regarding higher education. And regarding the framework that was put together by that panel, and Denise Bradley as the chair, was that there was to be taking away from state provision of regulation of a lot of higher education. You'd go to a national regulatory body. In that case, it was proposed that it wouldn't just be higher ed, it would also be vet. Yep. So instead of having the two bodies we've got to now, it was to be one national body. So it's an interesting thing to see whether this current review returns to that issue. And it is an issue for dual sector providers in my membership. So that's one of the things that comes up all the time. There is a lot of duplication. There are issues about how defining fit and proper persons should be decided, about financial viability and of various providers at both RTO and then also at the higher education provider level. But then there was, in a really big context, once a national body was set up, what Bradley and her team proposed was that you would move to moving Commonwealth supporting places, moving to student-centred funding and not to the way it is done today. Student-centred funding basically means that it wouldn't matter whether the provider was in the private sector or the public sector, the money would follow the choices of the students as 1 million students decided where they saw the market, their community involvement in the future and their workplace involvement in the future would go. And then eventually, said Bradley, that would then move to not just higher ed but also vet sector. So it was a very comprehensive and significant proposal that was put by that review. There was a lot that came out of the review. A big emphasis on research was another part of it. But those one of the starting points of that review was that the regulatory structure that would be set up with regard to providers, what Alistair and what Saxon do in their day jobs, and we'll just see whether that comes to pass in the future.
Thank you, Peter. That's a good reminder. Saxon.
Thanks, Adrienne. I'll touch on perhaps some of that in terms of Peter's comments, but let me start with I think where Alistair started around, I guess, what guides us as regulators in terms of the regulator performance guide, but just take a slight step back from that in the sense that, as many of you will be aware, ASQA has been on something of a reform journey for a couple of years now, which all began with a review of our regulatory, our governance, our regulatory culture and our practice, and that was the rapid review of ASQA. And for those that have had the time to have a look at that review and the recommendations there and the journey we're on, it very much aligns with those three key principles that you outlined, Alistair, in terms of being having that real collaboration and engagement flavour that includes very much a focus around the educative role that ASQA has within its functions, particularly also the way in which we can improve our practice around being risk-based and data-driven, and the continuous improvement and building trust component is incredibly important, and the continuous improvement part of it is very much also referred to within our functions. In the performance guide, it's referred to in terms of our own continuous improvement as the regulator, but within our functions, it is about the role that we take with the sector to support and encourage continuous improvement in the delivery of quality vet. So those things are, certainly are an incredibly important part of the journey that we're currently on. And I think that's also been informed more recently by the draft standards for RTOs that are now out for consultation, because they are taking very much both an outcomes focus and also particularly focus in many areas around that, the systems and processes in place around continuous improvement. So like Alistair, are we there yet? No, but I think we've made quite considerable inroads so far in a collaborative and in many areas co-designed approach with the sector. And we always knew that this was going to be a multi-year journey in this sense, in terms of really, I guess, working around the cultural change associated with moving away from compliance and input controls and into much more of a focus on outcomes. So for us, in terms of responsive regulation, and I think the way in which we've sought to implement the recommendations or work our way through the implementation of the recommendations from the rapid review, in the context, I would add, of that review being published right at the onset of the pandemic. So in many ways, it actually fast-tracked our implementation of some of those recommendations by necessity, because as I say, when it comes to that responsive regulation, whether it be to a global pandemic, recovery from the pandemic, or the myriad of other risks or potential risks that we deal with, our core role is to really understand the market that we regulate. And on top of that, then obviously the risks at play in the sector, the drivers of those behaviour, and then being able to really look at how we deploy strategies around that. So in order to do that, it really does come back to, I think, the collaboration and the engagements we have that go to improving regulatory outcomes. So from an ASQA TEQSA perspective, that's something that we have been working on quite considerably in recent years, and absolutely through the context of the pandemic, largely because we have such an area of shared responsibility, both as ESOS agencies, but also in relation to dual sector providers. So we really sought to strengthen that collaboration and engagement, even physically co-locating now here in our Melbourne office, so that we can do within our respective legislative frameworks and the different operating environments, start to really engage with those areas of the sector that we can help to relieve. I always struggle calling it regulatory burden, as I'm sure you can imagine, from a regulator's perspective, because we think everything we do is incredibly important. But nevertheless, to the ways in which we can streamline our approach. That, as I say, comes down to the strength of the collaboration and engagement and working together with the sector around those things. So I'd probably also just touch on from that perspective, because I did mention ESOS agencies, and Alistair rightly pointed to one of those key areas of risk for us being in the international education sector, and we're all familiar with some of the recent media, and this is particularly an area that ASQA has been very attuned to for some time, and working on a variety of regulatory activity in this space, as has TEQSA, and we both participate in the Education Regulation Immigration Committee, with that very purpose of having strong collaboration and engagement across government to work across those areas of shared responsibility with a view to addressing risk, sharing information, really being able to work as collaboratively as possible in those areas. So some of the challenges there, though, that continue, I think, for us is, am I getting the wind up?
Yes.
Is data. I unashamedly would put data on the table as being one of those limiting factors for us at the moment, particularly in a VET context where we have a lag of data in relation to just some of the basics around enrolments and completions of generally at best of a 9-month lag. Now that really presented itself quite starkly at the onset of the pandemic, because it was very difficult for government or the regulator to get a good picture as to the extent of the potential issues for students in particular. So data is a really key one for us. The extent to which we can continue within our frameworks to work collaboratively together to address some of the issues that Peter was raising in the context of how the regulatory environment was envisaged some 12 or so years ago. And they're probably the two most key I'd leave on the table, Adrienne, for discussion.
Thank you. Luke.
Adrienne, thank you, and thank you for having me. The thing you missed from my bio was I was the 2019 TEQSA Conference MC, which is a career highlight for me. But I'm delighted to be finally invited back. So thank you very much. But I must say, I had the privilege of working on the TEQSA task force as a junior bureaucrat when I had lots of hair and less of a waistline back in 2011. And one of the things, I think that was one of the major series of reforms coming out of Bradley, which Peter's so eloquently gone through. But one thing I wanted to highlight about Bradley in particular, which is what we're seeing here with the Higher Education Accord approach, is it was bipartisan. And by the time it hit the Senate for legislation, there was broad bipartisan support for it. And that's been an integral part, I think, of the success of TEQSA, because you've outlived changes of government. While we've had reform and changes to the legislation and review, TEQSA still exists. And I remind everyone in this room, you're not yet a teenager. You're only 12. So I think that the sector working collaboratively and closely with you and in a bipartisan way is allowing TEQSA's regulatory and quality assurance to mature, and that's a wonderful thing. But from a university perspective, and Adrienne and I had a little discussion about this before today's session, I wanted to step through some of the other things, the other regulatory issues that have come up over the last decade. And it will come as no surprise to you, a lot of those are driven by geopolitical tensions and foreign interference and other issues that are beyond the control of universities in Australia and, of course, the regulator. And we have to work, in an international and global context. And it's very important that we do to continue the freedom of academic expression, that we continue to work globally. There's been a number of things, and I just wanted to step you through a timeline. For universities, our regulatory burden exists way beyond TEQSA, and the expertise that we have to develop to deal with that regulatory burden is also then scattered right across the Commonwealth in different departments, from the Attorney General's Department to the Home Affairs Department to the Defence Department to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So increasingly there is this a number of regulatory systems and processes that have been put in place to deal with the changing nature of the global environment, but they're being stretched across the Commonwealth. And we've made this comment to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security and to various ministers and to regulators throughout the last decade, that is getting, it's stretched and it's not particularly deep in expertise. And it's also creating a demand for more professional staff, in particular at our universities, to have a depth of expertise across all of those departments. But I'll just step you through the last decade and then give you an understanding of the kind of things that my member universities and other universities and higher education providers are dealing with. 2012, the Defence Trade Controls Act comes in, which has measures in which how we can operate in the defence space. In 2018, there's another review of the Defence Trade Controls Act. In 2018, there was the introduction of the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct of Research. In 2018, many of you remember ANU suffered a major cyber attack, which then led to the introduction of the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme. Then again, in 2019, the Defence Trade Control Act was released again. In 2019, we had the Defence Industry Security Program announced. In 2019, towards the end of that year, the University Foreign Interference Task Force was established. In 2019 again, the UFIT did some work around those cyber attacks. In 2020, the Australian Foreign Relations State and Territory Arrangements Act was introduced, and everyone was surprised to see that there was a special section for universities, and of course we've been working with DFAT ever since. In 2021, of course, UFIT guidelines were refreshed, and more recently in 2021 we've had the introduction of the Critical Infrastructure List and the Critical Technologies List more recently this year. There are a range of things that we have to deal with that are outside of TEQSA. So our regulatory burden has increased. It's increased, though, I must stress, out of necessity. That there are things that are happening globally that we have to respond to. And I think one of the things I want to highlight, while it has been, there's a lot of stuff happening with university regulation across different departments, there is a lot of goodwill and there's a lot of consultation. And we have improved processes, particularly when it comes to things like critical infrastructure and when it comes to the Foreign Relations Act. And of course, TEQSA, I think we always point to as for universities and those other departments as being the flagship approach in terms of consultation. But it is really an era where the regulatory landscape is just exploded in terms of what we have to do, and we struggle to keep up. There are other measures, of course. There's things like, review into academic freedom and freedom on campus. Those things come up and, of course, are an increase in regulatory system. And TEQSA then often has to be asked to see how it can fit in with the current thresholds, standards, etc. So we work collaboratively, but I must stress it's a very big area of responsibility for our universities, and it's something that we always stress that we hope that the government can understand that burden is increasing year on year. There was a series of excellent recommendations out of the bipartisan Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security in the last Parliament, and I've got great confidence that will continue under the current chair, but it is an ongoing negotiation and discussion with the Commonwealth. Not to even mention what we do with state governments as well. I want to touch on a few other things as well, but particularly during COVID, it highlighted the fact that we had very rigid structures in terms of how we can deal with students studying online and bring them back into the country, opening up our borders. All of these things became core regulatory business for university groupings and university executive and higher education providers, of course. And then that then led to the rise of the importance of state governments, who had a lot of control over what we could and couldn't do. And those of you, particularly from Victoria, remember when we could and couldn't open campuses and how many people we could have in a room. Those regulatory burdens just came out of nowhere because we'd never dealt with them before. So I think as a sector have done really well, but we have, in limited resources with less capacity to pay for the expertise we need, particularly while our borders were closed, it's been a quite stressful time to deal with all of that. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So we do have time for questions. I don't think we have a roving mic. I think this... Oh, we do! Terrific. So this is an opening session for the three sections that we've got. So these are some thought starters to start thinking about where we are at with regulation and where we might be going. So questions, far away. There's one down... Hello? There's one down here.
Hi, Alyssa Holswich from Endeavour College of Natural Health. We are one of Peter's dual sector providers, so private institution based in, 5 states, 6 campuses, but head office in Queensland. We, as a dual sector provider, followed the Bradley Review very closely, and everyone has opinions, obviously, but I'd love to hear the opinions, particularly of Saxon and Alistair, on whether a true single regulator is even possible, or ever going to be possible, given the such different requirements that still exist in both of the sectors under the standards.
Who wants to tackle?
Rock and roll.
Okay, thanks. Look, it's a really good question. And it's a really difficult one to answer, because I think you rightly point to the quite considerable differences between the sectors and the frameworks and the operating environments and all of those things. So, ultimately that will be a decision for others to the extent that it reaches a decision point. But I think, Alistair and I have actually talked about this from the perspective of, it's not just from our perspective, the dual sector, but also, as I say, the extent to which we also have in common the ESOS framework, and we both regulate ELICOS providers as well as CRICOS providers, and the way, therefore, we can both work around, and this actually goes beyond just us as the two education regulators, or two of a number actually, education regulators, because you've got to remember there's two state-based regulators, and the department's also a regulator as well. But right across government, actually, there are some fundamentals about regulation, and this is a little bit of, I think, what Luke was pointing to, that we could arguably utilise better. So have a consistent understanding of and way that we would be satisfied by things like fit and proper person requirements, notifications in certain areas, all of those sorts of things. So that's been an area that not only have ASQA and TEQSA been grappling with in terms of what we can do in common and how we most effectively do that, but right across the regulatory network. I was part of the regulator leadership cohort that had been established about 18 months ago, and that was certainly those opportunities, the ways in which we can consider that right across government. So fully appreciate that's not directly answering your question, but it isn't an easy one. And there are, though, those ways in which, at a variety of levels, be it strictly between ASQA and TEQSA or more broadly across government, that I think we can find more effective ways of reducing the, I won't say burden, I'll say requirements, and we're certainly actively doing that here.
Yeah, I'm not from the sector, so I was a bit struck when I began in the role at what appeared to be a little bit of an elephant in the room, ASQA and TEQSA, should they be merged, etc. And will this government or the next government return to that question at some point, etc. But given the quite distinct differences between the two sectors and the legislative and other frameworks for governance and regulation, etc., I think there's an open question about whether a combined body would actually service the regulated entities as effectively or more effectively than the current setup, notwithstanding an acknowledgement that there are dual sector issues that ASQA and TEQSA need to be talking about and engaging dual sector providers on. And there's a lot that we can do around risk assessments, for example, or some sort of mutual recognition of registration or accreditation, etc. So that's a process that we've commenced with ASQA between Saxon and I, and a working group that we've set up, and we're keen to engage with peak bodies and individual providers around just teasing out properly, shared understanding of what is the dual sector regulatory burden, and what parts of that can and should we be addressing.
Yeah, sure.
So just to add to that conversation, whether you had a single authority or not, I think you'd probably have two divisions, and one would be higher ed and one would be vet. And
which is the way that a lot of providers structure it as well.
Indeed. So there would be, but when it gets to it, when we're talking about these issues, it's the outcomes that really matter. The actual structure is, in some ways, a secondary issue. Yeah. So the outcomes that we're looking for is better data, streamlining between the two agencies and the Department of Education, that we get more symmetry between the registration processes for CRICOS or the various activities that are being undertaken, that our members, for example, would collectively would prefer that if you are a TEQSA registered organisation, that should suffice, and you shouldn't have to go through the same process to get registered under ASQA. There should be a mutual recognition set up there, and so there's quite and to say it again, there's the fit and proper person tests, and there's the financial viability tests and issues like that. So there's a lot there, but it's the outcomes that matter. Yep. And I think that if I could just say one more thing, which is to the point of all these regulatory matters, and Alistair opened up talking about it, which is that PM&C has an Office of Best Practice Regulation, and the best practice regulation that the federal government imposes requirements for cost-benefit analysis and regulatory impact statements, and they should be done for all these things, and they're not actually, but they should be, so that we get a transparent process to weigh up the costs and benefits of the issues that we're looking at.
So unfortunately, we've run out of time in this session. I know, we're going to move through things. Yes, 2:10. But
just getting warmed up.
But I was going to say, I'm conscious that Luke here hasn't had any questions. Is there one more question? Knowing that the design of this whole session is that we'll get deeper and deeper into conversations about regulation, so there'll be opportunities for you to ask questions, if not of these folk, that of myself and subsequent speakers. But it's one more question.
Sonia from the University of Canberra. I was just wondering, in terms of the role of TEQSA with accrediting courses for non-accredited institutions, whether that's something that TEQSA would look at perhaps not doing, and because that, I understand, is a lot of what you do, and looking at engaging experts in other areas, perhaps universities, academics, etc., to do that role and focus more on what that regulation, data, compliance is.
I assume your question's directed to me. one thing that we've done as part of our current internal review of our practice, for example, is to observe that the evidence requirements for re-registration are almost 100% overlap with the evidence requirements for an application for self-accrediting authority by a provider. So what we're moving to do now is, well, when it comes around for a re-registration, we also consider self-accrediting authority for that provider. So that's one way of, if you like, loosening up the system and directing our resources where they should be directed. And your question goes to part of our current internal review about just to what extent is our re-accreditation regime fit for purpose, if you like, and are there alternate ways or different pathways to maintaining our regulatory, if you like, oversight and focus around accreditation of courses, but in a way that doesn't generate this demand-driven churn, if you like, and a heavy sort of evidence requirements, which may not go to the regulatory principle of being risk-based, proportionate, necessary, etc. So that's certainly a sort of a live theme for us over the next 12 to 18 months. What we're doing at the moment is developing, or we're about to present to Commission, a scope for the development of and I hesitate to phrase it like this, but we may term it as something else, but a supervisory risk statement akin to the APRA model for the prudential risk for the finance sector, whereby we can then start to think about categories of risk and scaling around risk category our regulatory presence and activity. Now that's a fair way down the track, and it's something that we'll need to, once we've done some further thinking ourselves about what those settings might or should be, engage with the sector and of course with the government, and the extent to which that then begs some legislative or other reform. There's a nice opportunity for us to actually inform the Accord and that review process and potentially some outcomes. I don't want to jump through several hoops before we get to that, but that's the kind of thinking that we're going through at the moment.
Well, a bit of a rush job, but can we thank...
And no one mentioned cost recovery, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and... No. So, can we thank this panel? And